Before we get into the specifics of Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery, it's worth first understanding the different business continuity strategies that are available. So the first one is high availability, and we talked a little bit about this in the virtual machines module. This is really the case where we run another instance of apps in the case of a catastrophic failure. So maybe a blade on the first rack of servers goes down, and we've got an availability set configured for our virtual machine. Well, that will fail over to another set of hardware. That's basically our high availability option. In addition, we have disaster recovery. This is where we run our app in a second data center so that if a failure occurs to the primary, the secondary is still online, the app will still continue to run. We might get a blip for some users that were connecting to that primary system, but through the load balancing technology, they would be rerouted to the secondary node. And then finally, we have backup itself, and this is where we want to restore data. So we might have our original set of data that's constantly being backed up, and then if something goes wrong with that data, we can restore it, or perhaps we want to restore the entire virtual machine, perhaps in response to a disaster like the previous option. We could then just do a standard restore of that machine. Now, Azure Backup in particular is one of the products Microsoft provides you in Azure, and this is a backup solution that's been purposely built for the cloud and comes with a number of features. In particular, we've got unlimited scaling. Azure Backup will use the underlying power and scale of Azure Cloud to give you high availability, no maintenance or monitoring overhead. You can set up alerts, but there's no real overhead from your perspective to kind of scale up the system. In addition, you get unlimited data transfer as well. So Azure Backup does not limit the amount of inbound or outbound data that you can transfer. It does not charge for the data that is transferred. However, if you decide to use some of these import-export services to import large amounts of data, then you might incur some costs at that point. But otherwise, it's a very cost-effective service to utilize. We also then have the multiple storage options as well. So it supports LRS and GRS. If you recall from the storage module, LRS is locally redundant storage. This is where it replicates your data 3 times in a storage scale unit in a data center. Or we can use GRS, which is geo-redundant storage. And this is the default and recommended option because it's basically taking your data to a secondary region. This is hundreds of miles away from the primary region. Costs more than LRS, but if a whole entire data center or region goes down, then you can still recover your data via the other region. Then we have long-term retention, so there's no limit to how long you can keep your data in what's called a recovery services vault that you'll learn more about. You can keep it as long as you like, but you are limited to 9,999 recovery points per protected instance, but that should be plenty for almost everybody's backup situations. Then we get application consistent backups. Now, I would say that Azure advertises this, but it does depend on which service you utilize, and you'll learn about the different services in a moment. Otherwise, they'll be crash consistent if you're not using any of those services in particular. And finally, data encryption, naturally, like a lot of other Azure storage services, is supported to allow for secure transmission and storage of your data in the public cloud. So let's take a look at the Azure Backup components that are available to you as well. Well, first of all, we have the Azure Backup Agent, also known as the Mars Agent. This allows for file level restore, system state restore. It's not really a VM backup, but you'll see this in one of the demos, but allows for file level kind of recovery of services for you. Then you have a couple of others which require servers. So you've got System Center DPM and Azure Backup Server. You might be using System Center DPM already on premises, and you can utilize that with Azure Backup. Azure Backup Recovery Services Vault would essentially become a target for DPM, and DPM stands for Data Protection Manager. It's a service a lot of people have been using for a long time. There's Azure Backup Server, which you can install on premises or in Azure as well if you like. And then finally, Azure does include an IaaS VM backup, which you will see in the demo as well. In fact, the course really calls for the first and the fourth option here. So we'll look at the Mars Agent recovery and the IaaS VM backup recovery in the subsequent demos to follow. Now, if you want to know about how all these different options compare, because it can get very confusing, simply head over to this link, which I'll select. And if you scroll down, you'll see a table, which I'll zoom into. And it says which Azure Backup components should I use? And it breaks it down by the various options. So for the Azure Backup Mars agent, what are the benefits? You can see it backs up files and folders. It's limited to Windows only. Backup 3 times per day, and backups are stored in Recovery Services Vault. Scrolling down, you can get the details of DPM and all its extra features, Azure Backup Server and all its extra features, and then finally the IaaS VM backup as well and all of its features. So it's a good reference site if you're trying to figure out, well, which is the right option for me. But like I said, you'll see us demo the first and the fourth option coming up very shortly. Now, before we get into those demos, the last thing just to mention is a couple of the other recovery options. I already mentioned we've got Azure Site Recovery, we've got Azure Backup, but there are 2 other options that you can utilize as well. First one being Snapshot Recovery. So Snapshot Recovery utilizes the underlying blob storage. You can essentially do blob snapshots taken of your VM page blob. These can be copied into the same or different regions. So you can create a storage account in another region and copy your snapshot across to it. And then you can basically get your VM from that snapshot. You create it from the snapshot itself. It can be application consistent, but only if the VM was shut down. So if you shut down a VM gracefully, take your snapshot, copy it to another region, instantiate that VM, it will be application consistent. Otherwise, it's essentially a crash consistent recovery option. The other option we have is geo-replication, and this essentially allows us to use the underlying Azure Storage GRS option, geo-redundant storage, which basically replicates our data to a region far away from the primary. And this allows us to then recover in the event of an outage to the entire region, or if we just had an outage and we wanted to recover from that data that's been replicated over there. It also has that RA GRS, that means it's read available, read access is the official term. There's an RA GRS option available, so if we wanted to, we could just take that geo-replicated virtual machine as an example and power it on in the other region that's warm and ready for us to go. Or if we just wanted to read some of the data, we could do that as well. So these are 2 other options, a little bit more manual in operation. They're not really automated recovery options, although it is technically possible to do some of that with Azure Automation and PowerShell. But this essentially is more of a kind of a manual recovery type option.